back in 1522 in Zurich, Switzerland, 2 pieces of sausage were at the heart of a huge controversy. You see, it was the second Sunday in Lent, and a printer there named Christoph Froschauer sat down at a table with 12 of his friends and proceeded to carve up 2 pieces of sausage so that they could eat them and enjoy them. Well, why would that cause such a stir? Well, the thing was, at that time, Christian church leaders were teaching people that to eat meat at any time during Lent was a sin and made you unacceptable to God. Well, Christoph Froschauer and his friends were among those who disagreed. And so they were trying to make the point that God accepts us not based on what we do or don't, not based on what we eat or don't eat, but instead that God accepts us on the basis of grace and grace alone. As a case in point in our reading today in Romans, the Apostle Paul points our attention to the Old Testament figure of Abraham as an example of God's grace. Why did God choose Abraham? Paul asked. Why did God declare Abraham to be righteous in God's eyes? Well, our usual response to a question like that is to say something like this. Well, if God chose Abraham and declared Abraham to be righteous, it must have been because Abraham was righteous. It must have been because Abraham was a sinless and godly man. That's why God chose Abraham. But Paul, in our reading here in Romans, invites us to give that line of reasoning a second think. First off, Paul asks, did God declare Abraham to be righteous because Abraham fully obeyed all of God's laws and commandments? Well, that can't be it, Paul said, because God didn't even give Moses the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law until about 400 years after the time of Abraham. So that can't be the reason. Next, Paul asks, well, was Abraham declared to be righteous because he took part in the religious rituals that God prescribed, such as the ritual of circumcision? But again, that can't be the reason either, because God did not establish circumcision as the sign of the covenant community until God first had declared Abraham to be righteous and accepted him. So how did Abraham get that special status? What did he do to earn God's favor like that? The answer, Paul says, is nothing. Abraham didn't do anything to earn God's acceptance. Instead, the Bible simply says that Abraham believed. That Abraham believed that God loved him and had an amazing plan for his life. In other words, Abraham was accepted and approved by God simply because Abraham was willing to believe and to put his trust in the fact that God is a God of grace. That God is a God who loves us, not because we have earned that love and God owes it to us. Rather, God is a God of grace who loves us even when we don't deserve that love. In the 2nd century, there was a Christian by the name of Marcion. And Marcion attracted a rather large following when he said that Christians ought to ignore and get rid of the Old Testament. Because according to Marcion, the God of the Old Testament is a completely different God from the God we find in the New Testament. According to Marcion, the God of the Old Testament is an angry God, a God of vengeance and wrath. Whereas the God of the New Testament is a kinder and gentler God, a God full of love and grace. Ultimately, though, the Christian church rejected Marcion's ideas, in part by pointing to passages like here that we heard today in Romans, where Paul reminds us that grace was not something new that God sent into the world through Jesus. Rather, grace has been a part of God's being from the very beginning, even from God's first early dealings with Abraham there in those first chapters of Genesis. But the thing is, it seems that something about the whole idea of grace tends to rub a lot of people the wrong way. It's like a cartoon I saw some time ago in a magazine that showed one couple getting ready to leave another couple's house. They were standing at the door, and the couple getting ready to leave said, "Thank you for having us over for dinner. We had a really good time. But since we're not into giving payback dinners, could we just give you $80 and call it even?" When someone does something for us, when someone gives us a gift or does something nice for us, for a lot of us, that causes us to feel uncomfortable. And so we try to arrange things so it looks like we paid for or in some way earned what we've received. But here in Romans, Paul is making it painfully obvious to us that when it comes to God, we can't pay for God's favor. We can't pay for God's acceptance. All we can do is accept it as a gift. In case there's any doubt of that, Paul says, then consider the story of Abraham. Yes, Abraham did have his good moments, like in this story we heard today from the 12th chapter of Genesis, when God came to Abraham one day and told him to pack up all of his belongings and to immediately head out to a new, strange, different land that he had never seen before, simply because God told him to. And right away, Abraham obeyed and packed up all his belongings and went, because God told him to. But then, later on, in that very same 12th chapter of Genesis, consider this episode. Once there was a famine in the land, and so Abraham and his wife Sarah had to go down to Egypt, because at that time that was the only place where there was food. But along the way to Egypt, Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, he said, "Sarah, since you're rather pretty, when we get down to Egypt, I'm going to tell people that you're my sister. Because I'm afraid that if some powerful man in Egypt falls in love with you, he might kill me in order to marry you. So I'll just tell everyone that you're my sister." Well, when they get down to Egypt, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, falls in love with Sarah.